Welcome, everyone, to Power Parsha Pearls. And this week, we're going to be looking at a continued version of the story of the Exodus, in particular, the specifics relating to the broader story as we know it. I was wondering to myself the other day, why is it that we Jews are taking the war in Ukraine so personal? We seem to have reacted to it with a particular sense of anguish, and we seem to almost take it personal in a very deep way. And I believe the reason is simply because we Jews have had a very long-standing relationship with Ukraine. Jews have been living in Ukraine for a millennium. In the 17th and 18th centuries, 80% of Jews lived in that part of the world. And no other Jewish community in the world suffered like the Ukrainian Jewish community. The pogroms of 1648, 1649 by the Kazakhs murdered between near 300,000 Jews in horrific ways. The pogroms over the following centuries were equally horrendous. During the civil war after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, 100,000 Ukrainian Jews were murdered. Before the Holocaust, 2.4 million Jews lived in Ukraine, but suffered terribly under Stalin's regime. And then, of course, came June 1941, when Nazis invaded. And over the next 2 years, 1.6 million Jews actually perished there. I mean, Ukrainians followed the German army from city to city, shtetl to shtetl, gathering the Jews from the outskirts of the city, shooting them into pre-dug graves or ravines. And after the war, many Jews returned to Ukraine, but under the tyranny of communism and deep anti-Semitism. Most of them hid their Judaism completely. Ukrainian Jewry, it seemed, was but all over. And then communism fell, and the impossible happened before our very eyes. To see what happened in Ukraine over the past 3-4 decades is the stuff of legend. The Renaissance of Jewish life was one of the great miracles of our times. 183 rabbis and their families moved out there and took responsibility for the material and spiritual well-being of all the Jews there, restoring their Jewish dignity, helping to restore their Jewish pride, building shuls, building schools, literally thriving, flourishing in ways unimaginable. And then, of course, alas, over the last many months, what is it now, almost 2 years? Chaos ensued once more. Hundreds of thousands made journeys from their bombed out cities to other countries. Babies and the elderly mothers who had just given birth and orphans traveling for days, sometimes without food or water, sobbing, crying, frightened. How does this happen in the 21st century? To watch a country being destroyed, so many Jewish communities being destroyed, so many of our brothers and sisters in danger, so many refugees who need to start all over again and don't know when they will return and to what they will return is heart-wrenching. So what I want to consider here are what are the lessons learned, and indeed specifically the parallels with the Egypt story that we're presently reading about. Number one, look at the power of an unbridled ego. Putin built up Russia and helped build Judaism in Russia, in actual fact. He helped personally many Jews significantly, but his legacy is going to go down as a monster. You see what an unbridled ego can do? What the need to be victorious at all costs can bring a person to do? It defies all rationality, it defies all moral sensibility, and you engage in a war just to wreak havoc and destruction on millions of people. Is that not what happened with Pharaoh as well? First, he was ignoring the good that the Jewish people did for his economy. Didn't Joseph save his country from market meltdown? And yet he asks arrogantly, who is God that I should listen to him? And even as everything is falling apart around him with the blood and the frogs and all the other plagues besides, he still quite astoundingly, absolutely refuses to let the Jewish people go. And there's an immediate lesson here for all of our lives. I'm not comparing anybody to Pharaoh or to Putin. I am saying, though, that sometimes our egos and the need to win can blind and eclipse everything good inside of us and compel us to think, say, and do things that are foolish and destructive. Even when things are clearly collapsing around us, we simply remain stuck in our ways. Think about that, because I'm sure we can all relate to it on some level. Number two, lesson for Israel. People have lectured Israel for decades that they should not be afraid to make concessions, even if it might endanger them, because don't worry, we've got your back. The free world is behind you. But look what happened in Ukraine. Despite the world screaming, Ukraine has to ultimately fight alone. Yes, armaments are being sent to whatever extent. Israel may be strong spiritually and militarily, and of course we want to cultivate all friendships, but as history has proven time and again, we don't surrender our fate to anybody but ourselves. In the Egypt story, when Moses encountered an Egyptian beating up on an Israelite, he knew he had to neutralize the Egyptian. No one else would stand up for that Jew, regardless of how many might have said, don't worry, we've got your back. The Torah advocates taking action into our own hands and employing all natural means to protect ourselves. Don't rely on other people necessarily coming to your rescue. Number 3, the role and leadership of the Jewish president. Vladimir Zelensky was born in 1978 in a working class Jewish family. Like nearly all Jews in Ukraine, they suffered, that is the family, tremendously during the World War. His grandfather, who commanded an artillery platoon in the Red Army, lost his own father and 3 of his brothers in the Holocaust. And in 2010, this former comedian was elected president. And then overnight, the invasion thrust Zelensky into a different role, one that at first seemed so utterly ill-suited to his character. His friends, his advisors often said that he was very sensitive, he was brittle, he had thin skin. He suffers from the actor's malady, an abiding need to be liked, to be applauded. As one of them said, we try not to let him look at Facebook because critical comments from strangers are liable to upset, maybe even depress him. But when Russian bombs started to fall on Ukrainian cities and troops moved to surround the capital, he underwent a transformation before our eyes. He came to embody a struggle that most Western statesmen had long forgotten how to fight, the one that is sometimes required to keep tyranny from killing off democracy. Zelensky not only rallied his own people to defend their nation, inspiring them to just do simple things like tossing makeshift petrol bombs at Russian military vehicles or standing in the way of tanks. And he galvanized the world's democracies in ways that seemed unthinkable just weeks before the war began. He decided to stay in his capital, an act of courage that has already altered the course of history. He roused the United States and all of its allies to impose unprecedented penalties and sanctions against Russia. Germany, imagine, decided to pour more than 100 billion into its military, casting aside what was otherwise a post-war tradition of pacifism that had long frustrated so many of Germany's allies. Switzerland broke from its tradition of neutrality to support sanctions. And if you might remember, on the 6th day of the invasion, Zelensky delivered a speech via video feed to the European Parliament. And he said, do prove that you are with us. Do prove that you will not let us go. Do prove that you are indeed Europeans. And then life will win over death. Light will win over darkness. And as one observer noted during that talk or after that talk, it was as if Charlie Chaplin had morphed into Winston Churchill. Was that then not the reality of Moses as well? He was a virtual unknown. Who knew about him? Nobody. And he was utterly initially reluctant to rise to the challenge of becoming a leader. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? He expresses reluctance time and again, and each time as God tells him and encourages him, he resists. He faces resistance from the enemy and ambivalence from his own people. He has a formidable task ahead of him. He has to vanquish the enemy and he has to rouse the spirit of his forlorn flock. But what happens? Ultimately, he rose to the task at hand and he becomes regarded as the greatest leader ever. You see how history can transform someone in such powerful ways, and see how one Jew in a small country can alter a world. Time magazine gave its main story last year the title, How Vladimir Zelensky Defended Ukraine and United the World. And the message for you and me again is, don't underestimate your own powers and abilities. When you find yourself in a position where you are being called upon to rise to whatever the task, recognize that that's your moment. Destiny brought you there. Don't squander it. You never know who's relying on you. Number 4, we are one. One of the great transformations that took place in the Exodus story is how we evolved from survival of the fittest in Egypt into a nation bound as one, in the words of the commentaries, as one man with one heart when we stood at Sinai. Think about how the whole Egyptian saga began. There was discord between Joseph and his brothers. Then at one point they throw him in a pit. And immediately after that, the verse says they sat down to eat their bread. Can you understand that? Their brother is screaming out from a pit. Their brother is begging for mercy, not to be left to die. And they sit down and they eat. How can a person eat at such a time? How could a person hear the screams of another human being and go on eating? Well, when you think about it, in our own little way, we're very much guilty of the same. We wake up in the morning, we pick up the paper, we read about wars, suffering, whatever it is going on in our world, and then we sit down and we eat our breakfast. We come home at night, we tune into the news, we hear about yet other calamities, and then we sit down and we eat our dinner. Sure, we're aware of world events or even personal struggles. Much like the brothers, we can hear the cries of our fellow human beings, but do we feel the pain as we sit down to eat our bread? It's precisely this indifference that led to Joseph being sold, the family eventually going down there in the face of hunger, ultimately settling there, and then, of course, eventually the exile that ensues. And so they continued amidst much disparity for the next 2 centuries, survival of the fittest, each one fending for themselves. But even as we see fragmentation and disparity, the hard fact is that world events, time and again, suddenly trigger something within us. And they demonstrate how we are a single organism. When something really goes wrong, we get snapped back into some kind of reality check. When those Jews finally emerged from all of that suffering and servitude, they stood at Sinai, in the words again of the Torah, as one entity, in appreciation of the fact that that which unites us is far greater than that which divides us. And indeed, much as we all live for ourselves, when we see pain, when we see suffering, we do ask, what can I do to help my brothers, my sisters in Ukraine, refugees, spiritually, financially, any way possible? Because at the core, it's not like we are Americans who are also Jewish, or British who are also Jewish, or Canadians who are also Jewish. We are first and foremost Jewish. And then based on our geographical locations, we're either British Jews or American Jews or Canadian Jews. And when something happens in any one place, we feel it someplace else. Like any family member, however far away, if something happens to my brother and sister on the other side of the world, it doesn't lessen the impact, and we step up. But key here is we need not wait for something to happen before we appreciate the essential need to unite together. We need to maintain that level of unity as best as we can, always and throughout. And finally, number 5, a nation not afraid of change. One of the primary tasks of the Jewish people when they left Egypt and traveled the desert was to build a sanctuary. It was a magnificent edifice. When they would rest, they would assemble it. And when they would embark on the next phase of their journey, they would disassemble it. There were a lot of stops and starts on the way to the promised land post-Exodus. And the task of taking down and putting up that sanctuary was arduous. But Jewish people know we're always on a journey. To be a Jew is to wander, to travel, to know that wherever I find myself, I continue the mission I seek to build. Indeed, after 40 years in the desert, when they finally arrived, they built the land of Israel. And 3,000 years later, when emerging from the ashes of the Holocaust, they built once more, turning a desert into a land flowing with milk and honey. Many rabbis left Ukraine with their communities, upping sticks overnight, leaving everything behind. But no sooner did they arrive wherever, and these selfless rabbis and their wives and their families set up new communities in new places. And when so many of them have now had the unbelievable sacrifice to return, they're rebuilding once more. Because here's key. A people that never stops traveling is one that never grows old or stale or complacent. It may live in the here and now, but it is always conscious of the past and the still beckoning future. Like the Jews in Egypt, refugees, the rabbis, they remind us that as difficult as things can get, we are a people who are never scared of change because we're anchored in the God of eternity. We hold hands together in all of our journeys because we have faith and we have each other. And of course, we yearn for that day when we will, of course, reach journey's end and arrive at our promised land. Indeed, as we famously say, L'Shana Haba V'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, may we merit that day speedily.